I was the executive director from April 1973 until February 1995, about 22 years.
And where in the pecking order were you in terms of succession? Were you the third executive director or the fourth? Do you recall offhand? Second?
At ABAG, I was the fourth executive director after Will Smith, Wilbur Schmidt, and John Baget, who, among the three of them, occupied 12 years. Well, when I came here in April '73, I had already found out in the 3 or 4 months between my being approached about whether I would like to apply for the job when I was in Washington, D.C., and actually coming here. In that four-month period, I had found out that ABAG was different from most of the similar councils of governments around the United States. So I was the deputy director of in those days, relatively sophisticated council of governments, and we did transportation planning as well as land use planning. We did quite a lot of work in the public safety field and some other different aspects of everyday life, and had a whole raft of committees, both technical and policy making, in the overall metropolitan area, which included Virginia and Maryland, as well as the District of Columbia. So when I thought about coming here, and then did come here, I realized that I was coming to an organization which didn't do quite a lot of that stuff. They did regional planning per se in a strict sort of sense, and they did it rather well, I must say, before my time. But they didn't do transportation planning, and they certainly didn't do things like public safety or anything of the kind. They did not see themselves as a service organization. And so for me, that was the principal difference to which I would be coming.
And what made you decide to come knowing, knowing realistically that it was a sophisticated theoretical planning institution or organization, and yet had no teeth or power to implement anything?
Well, knowing that ABAG had limited power and influence, very little power, but some influence, it seemed to me that there was an opportunity, and this would be true in many parts of the United States, to develop along the way as metropolitan problems, the everyday ones we know about, pollution, traffic, sprawl, and so forth, as those became more and more evident to people. And so there seemed to me a sort of growth of opportunity there. And that's what I looked forward to being involved with, to see if I could do something useful in that regard.
So was this your first real foray to the Bay Area in '73?
Yes, this was my first visit. It was my second visit to the Bay Area. I had been to a conference in San Francisco, I think a couple of years earlier, and had been entranced by the area. I stayed an extra day, rented a car, drove down the coast, drove inland somewhat, and thought, oh, pretty nice around here. But it never occurred to me that I would be coming back here one day. And so when I was invited to apply, among, as it turned out, 150 other people applying, I jumped at the chance, knowing that this is a pretty neat area. Because in Washington, D.C. at that time, in the early '70s, it wasn't a place a lot of people particularly wanted to leave. You really felt you were at the center of the world almost. You'd had the Cuban crisis in the decade or so beforehand, when you rode home, let's say, to the suburbs or to your part of the district where you lived from downtown, and people talked on the bus, and they all knew they could be incinerated tomorrow as Kennedy and Khrushchev faced off over the nuclear missiles and that kind of thing. And so you really felt you were at the center of the world. And when you went to maybe dinner parties and so forth and the conversation flowed, again, it reinforced that notion. And so there weren't many places that if you were in Washington, you wanted to go to and leave the District of Columbia. But this was one, very much one, maybe the only one. In 1973, it was very much, I think, part of an emerging Bay Area scene as far as regional planning was concerned. On the one hand, a good deal had already been done with not all that much in the way of resources to do it. Wasn't a lot of federal assistance or any other kind of assistance, very much. But ABAG had established a coastal plan, a regional airport plan along with the nascent MTC, and an overall general plan. And they weren't bad. In fact, parts of them were really pretty darn good. And so, as I said, this was a journey that had been launched. Now, by that time, the early 70s, it was clear that rather more than that was going to be needed. A good many people felt that a more comprehensive regional agency was overdue, and that perhaps it should be dealing with air quality, transportation, land use, water quality, and so forth, in an overall comprehensive fashion. And attempts were made, principally led by Assemblyman Jack Knox of Richmond, to do that, and with the help of a good many other well-known legislators like Willie Brown. So that was a feeling that existed, along with opposition to that from people who were afraid of what that could lead to in terms of ultimately perhaps disappearing local control, which I think was a boogeyman, but nevertheless, people were led to believe that. There were taxpayers' associations in particular, which were the sort of Tea Party people of their day in, for example, Sonoma County, who said that ABAG is trying to achieve powers which would enable them to seize your home, take your home away from you. This is a communist organization, and so on and so on and so on. So that we had to cope with. The real reason came not from the right, but more from the left, from purists, hardline environmentalists, who wanted to have indeed a comprehensive regional planning agency, but one which was composed solely of elected officials, directly elected officials, not local government, mayors and supervisors and council members, whom they did not trust, whom they thought of as, oh, frequently, you know, in the pocket of developers, or at least sympathetic to developers, and therefore all too willing to let happen or to encourage sprawl further out into agricultural land out in the hinterland. Well, you asked me about services and ABAG's undertaking to provide services. My feeling had long been that essentially a regional council of governments is a member-owned cooperative, and that its members ought to be able to look to it to do things which either they can't do themselves or which they can only do at greater expense or less efficiently than doing it on a cooperative basis. And I set out as best I could to encourage our elected leaders within the organization to move in that direction for two reasons. One, because I thought it was the appropriate thing to do, as I've just been saying, but also because one of the drawbacks of being a regional planning agency is that you quite often have to tell constituent members, or encourage them, shall we say, to do things they didn't really want to do. So if you say to a jurisdiction, look, you're going to have to build, or you should build, need to build more low-income housing, that's not something generally they're going to welcome. And so to them, ABAG is a nuisance. Far better than if we can say, but remember this, we're the people who just saved you $1,800,000 on such and such. And so that was part of the reason as well. One of the first programs was, I guess, what we call credit pooling in those days, which was the beginning of what became a much larger program of financial assistance to members. And that idea I stole, borrowed. No, it was perfectly open, didn't steal it. Borrowed with attribution from the cities of Sonoma County, how many at the time, 7 or 8 or whatever it was, who had formed a special little agency so that they could, when issuing bonds to finance municipal improvements, could do it together at a lower issuance cost. And I thought, why can't we do that ourselves? With 100-odd member governments, surely we can really achieve some substantial savings, which we did. I mean, over the years, millions upon millions upon millions of dollars we have saved by doing that. And then one of the other early programs was risk management in the insurance sense, because it was a time of crisis when local governments could not get, in many cases, insurance for their activities, or else it was in a totally exorbitant level. Insurance is a business, public insurance like that, which tends, I don't know if it does nowadays, but in those days it certainly did tend to have troughs and peaks. And so you could find insurance pretty cheap for your local government one year, and then 3 years later it cost an arm and a leg. And I thought, well, this is ridiculous. Why can't we go into that business, about which we knew nothing, of course? And so with the assistance of Brian O'Toole, who was then a council member in Sunnyvale, and was in the insurance business, and gave us good advice, we went about doing this. And I called all the local governments together, all their representatives, city managers and attorneys eventually as well. Calling the attorneys together, which I thought was a brilliant idea, turned out to be a somewhat of a, well, I regretted it, let's say, because the attorneys, when assembled together, had an enormously enjoyable time pointing out that while they respected the opinion of a colleague from such and such a jurisdiction, they had to point out that on the other hand he was wrong, and this is the correct, and that went on for a long time, but eventually we got over that, got support for the idea, and today ABAG Plan, as it's called, Public Liability Assurance Network, which I think was the acronym, I think that was coined by my deputy, Eugene Leong, that is in existence today with, I think, about 30 members or so, and is still saving a great deal of money, and more particularly, I think, successfully instituting a sort of regime of being darn careful as a jurisdiction about what you and your employees do, watching out for potential hazards and that kind of thing, which any employee can do if they have the right mindset and see that the city or county knows about such and such a situation and deals with, that sort of mindset. So those were two of the major programs in the service direction that I feel good about. When I first came here, I think among the principal issues to be tackled were achieving a more comprehensive approach to how the region should grow, relating, air quality, water quality, land use, transportation together. And then in the back of my mind was the notion that ABAG should become a bit more, at least a bit more like several of the other leading councils of governments around the country and have a somewhat broader agenda of activities. So those were the two things I guess I had in mind, either at the forefront or at the back of my mind in those days. Well, if you look at what councils of governments do in places like Dallas, Fort Worth, Kansas City, Washington, D.C., and so on around the country, you will find that they provide, for example, let's say training services for local government employees. In some cases, I can think of Denver as an example. I don't precisely recall where else. They also arrange jointly hiring of employees, or certain employees, let's say police and fire, whatever it is. Or there's a police academy that they run. Now, I'm not saying that should be the case here at all, necessarily. But I do think that's a mindset in terms of service and what I previously referred to as a member-owned cooperative, what a cooperative should be doing for its members. Now, in the Bay Area, there's one big hazard about this that it's very hard to get over. An obstacle, I guess I should say. Hard to get over. There is this great big body of water, which you may have noticed, sitting in the middle. Not true in, let's say, Washington, D.C. Not true in Kansas City, Missouri, Kansas City, Kansas, in that bi-state area. Not true in lots of parts of the country, even if they're in a complicated area, like Washington, D.C., with virtually 3 states. We're lucky we have only the 1 state, but we do have this great big body of water. Now that separates people. It means, on the most simple level, you've got typically further to go to come to a meeting very often. And then there's a certain mindset about it as well. If you're in, I suppose, Oakland or Fremont, let's say, or Albany, then Burlingame and Belmont and Redwood City are there on the other side of the water. They're not just, a 5-minute, 10-minute drive away, as would be the case in some of those other metropolitan areas in the United States. So that has always been, and I'm afraid always will be, a barrier to be overcome. And it's why I think there is less of a tendency here in the Bay Area than there is in some other parts of the country for the local governments to turn to ABAG in our case, their own council governments in their cases, when some crisis arises or when some opportunity arises. They don't say, well, come on, what's ABAG going to do about it, sort of thing. They're usually slightly astonished when ABAG comes forth and says, well, we could do so-and-so. And then, if you're lucky, they'll say, oh, it's a great idea, we'll go along with that. But they don't have the mindset to turn towards it, usually, as would much more be the case in several other parts of the United States. I think it's because of that great big body of water, I would argue, which, of course, as we know, extends all the way around and up to the delta. The body of water that we're talking about, the so-called bay, even though it's really 4 bays, to some extent is a unifying factor. It certainly is in terms of its pollution in the past, about which, of course, with the advent of the Bay Conservation Development Commission and many other interested bodies, both volunteer and governmental, has been improving a great deal over the years. Still has a good way to go, but is improving. And so that certainly, I would agree, brings many of the local governments together in being concerned about that, because we all nowadays realize that this is something tremendously precious, which would change us forever were it not there. But I think that governmentally, in terms of moving forward as a metropolitan area overall, that aspect aside, the preservation of the bay aside, I think there is still a sort of deficit on that side vis-a-vis its influence on the Bay Area. It is a big barrier, in my mind, to cooperative development, shall we say. I don't exaggerate that, it's not disastrous, but it is an impediment that you don't have in the greatest Kansas City area or Dallas-Fort Worth or Denver or, you name it. I think the major accomplishments over the last 50 years have been, prior to my time, which was, as we were saying, was 1973, the 12 years before that, I think the people, both the top staff and especially the elected leaders of the day who were venturing on this for the first time, they deserve, I think, tremendous credit for overcoming a lot of doubts and achieving, for example, as we covered earlier, I think, a regional plan, once thought to be something rather airy-fairy, but which now is probably approaching more of a reality. The coastal plan, regional airport plan, and so forth, which ultimately came to be adopted by other statutory bodies. So I think that period was a nascent period in which, as I said, the people deserve a great deal of credit. Since then, I think we've continued along that path, and even though we did not achieve, at least not yet, a comprehensive agency, though I certainly would like to see it happen one day, nevertheless, nowadays, since my time, the principal regional agencies, the Air District, BCDC, and most especially ABAG and MTC, both at the top staff, well, all of the staff levels throughout, but in particular the elected leadership level, they are meeting frequently on a continued basis. They have their own elected, appointed, I should say, their own appointed planning director. They have institutionalized, if you like, a certain degree of cohesiveness, which in the absence of a truly single comprehensive agency isn't a bad way to go. It's a definite improvement, and I think deserves very considerable praise. So I'm very, very pleased to see that having been accomplished. Now, what's made that possible, I think, politically, is the bill, SB 375, which was authored by the Senate Pro Tem, President Pro Tem, as I recall, Darrell Steinberg. SB 375 essentially gives at last some measure of clout, for want of a better word, to the principal regional agencies like ABAG and MTC throughout California, such as SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments in Los Angeles, SANDAG, the San Diego Association of Governments, SACOG, the Sacramento area council governments, it gives them an ability and a duty to carry out certain programs to achieve a cleaner environment and a more sane development policy, which of course are related to each other. And on a narrower basis, it is designed to reduce the commute, which of course is very much MTC's concern, but it's also ABAG's concern because the commute has to do with how we distribute ourselves on this land of ours. And obviously the role of BCDC vis-a-vis the Bay that we were talking about and the Air Quality Management District's role in terms of the pollutants in the air, all of that is very relevant. So at last we have some measure of dealing with this in relation to the local governments. Now, local governments don't have to obey some terrifying mandate, but they do now, if they want, certainly if they want financial assistance, which most of them do, most of them need, from the center, now have to cooperate in developing in, shall we say, an intelligent overall fashion. The watchwords of the day are things like transportation-oriented development, smart growth, those kinds of things. And local governments, therefore, have to submit to the center, if you like, these agencies I'm talking about, their proposals along those lines, transportation-oriented development, let's say, for how they're going to develop. In other words, fitting into an overall regional plan for the first real time. And that's what I meant when I said that at last, maybe, the ABAG's regional plan of, good Lord, the late 60s or around 1970, maybe that finally is getting put into place. And so I feel pleased currently with the way things are going, and I certainly hope they continue either at that pace or preferably even more substantially. I think with regard to open space, and you see this in quite a few metropolitan areas in the country, but very much here. Those who are concerned about how the metropolitan area is going to develop over decades want to be as assured as they can, legally, politically, to maintain a sane amount of recreation and other open space uses that they can, and not have something which is going to be virtually paved over. And so here, long before my time, but certainly continuing through it and on into the future, I think, there is, par excellence, a tremendous concern about that, which you see, of course, in the Greenbelt Alliance and the Sierra Club and so forth. And that's why ABAG was so, for example, ABAG was so anxious to begin work on then Senator Bill Lockyer's great idea of the Bay Trail, biking and hiking trail around the Bay Area, which, with his blessing and MTC's acquiescence, because they could have done that if they had wished to do so, but were gracious in allowing ABAG to do that. That has continued to this day, and after what, I guess 18, 19, 20 years, and is on its way to completion. One of two major trails around, one being further inland as well, although that's not our responsibility, ABAG's responsibility. So overall, I think it's understandable that this incredibly beautiful area, enough people have been concerned with preserving forever, one hopes, this precious open resource away from bricks and mortar and concrete. ABAG was a strong proponent of the work that the proposed Golden Gate National Recreation Area was going to do. We did not, as I recall, play any real political role in that. That was much more Congressman Burton and other people's work on that. But like other agencies before them, like the regional coastal commissions, they were glad to be able to build on our work, and we certainly, people who had made their mark politically within ABAG were then able to go on and play a key role in the administration of the GGNRA after it had been achieved. Certainly the period of ABAG's official initiation in January 1961. And by the way, 2 years had been spent by some very hardworking, noble people, 1959, 1960, the last 2 years of the Eisenhower administration. Since 1961 until, I suppose, roughly the time I came here, which was 73, as I said, there was a period of laying down key contributors to sane growth. We've talked about the regional coastal plan, the regional open space plan, regional airport systems plan, and so forth, that kind of thing. But that period was also one which contained, in 1968, I think, a tremendous setback, which was the embezzlement by a key employee of an enormous amount of money. In today's money, I don't know, probably $2.5 million or so. I think it was 400,000 in those days. And I don't think I need to go into how that ultimately ended, except to say that ABAG did succeed in getting most of the money back eventually. That slowed things down, politically, emotionally, tactically, strategically. And I think it's one of the key reasons why ABAG was not awarded, as it would have been, I think, if we'd been anywhere else in the United States, to judge by what happened there, was not awarded the designation to do regional transportation planning. And that's why MTC and ABAG didn't come together. So that was one period. Good things, and then one setback. In the period after I came here, until my retirement, we built upon that previous work, as I hope any intelligent organization would do. And we then, as we've talked about, branched into becoming more of a, or let's say additionally, a service organization. Now, that was both for positive reasons, because it's a good thing to do, also perhaps negative reasons. We needed to earn some money, because having built up to being one of, I think it's fair to say, judging by awards we got and grants we got, one of the very best regional planning agencies in the country, we were then hit by this incredible triple whammy in 1978. One was the ending by the federal government of so-called 701, Section 701 money. That was a grant for general regional planning work, of which ABAG used to get regularly, the largest chunk in the country. Gone all of a sudden. Huge amount of money gone. We had also had, in the preceding two and a half to 3 years, an enormous grant of so-called 208 money from the Environmental Protection Administration, in which, with the blessing of the regional administrator of EPA, Paul DeFalco, in San Francisco, we had been able to put together, and the only outfit in the country that did this, water quality planning, air quality planning, solid waste planning, together in one overarching attempt to have a regional environmental plan. For that, we created a so-called Environmental Management Task Force, the EMTF. It was a huge thing because we had a huge grant. Paul DeFalco actually came into my office in the Claremont with a check for $4.3 million. Now today, that would be for the cameras an artificial check, a phony check. It was a real check. I mean, what would that be worth in today's money? I don't know, $23, $4 million? Unbelievable. But that's the way the federal government operated in those days. And of course, to us, it was a godsend, not only because it was colossal, but because we could invest it and make money off of it. Unbelievable. You think, why didn't the feds get the money? And eventually, of course, they wised up and did that. So we had this big amount of money to do that. We had the Environmental Management Task Force over 2.5 years or so. Then Mayor Dianne Feinstein chaired the effort with remarkable dedication. It was a time when her husband was terminally ill with cancer, and she looked after him as you would hope any devoted spouse would do, and yet still found time somehow to fulfill her responsibilities in San Francisco and run the Environmental Management Task Force political leadership. There were 46 people on it. John Tudor, supervisor from Napa County, was the vice chair of it. Eventually they reported in, what was it, 78, I think, and 77 into 78, and all hell broke loose because the construction industry was enormously upset by what they saw as the threat of loss of jobs. They thought that somehow more intensive growth in urban areas and less growth on prime ag land, agricultural land, would reduce the number of jobs. And so their joint organization of builders and employees, labor, called COLAB, Coalition of Labor and Business, headquartered, I think, in Contra Costa County, organized a tremendous effort to politically to zap the adoption of the Environmental Management Plan. And we fought that intensively. Eventually, with the aid of, particularly of the late Jack Maltester, who was the mayor of San Leandro, and with the involvement of Rod Durdon, who was then, I guess, the vice chair of ABAG, and Len Grote, who was the president, I should say, president and vice president. We got a compromise. If you want to look at it affirmatively, if you want to look at it negatively, you say it got watered down. But we did get an agreement. And Senator Nedgedly, who had introduced a bill which would have utterly destroyed the plan ever taking effect, then reversed himself completely and was good enough to introduce a bill which passed, saying virtually the reverse, that the EMP shall take effect, this compromise, the EMP shall take effect, and the state can modify it only if they give us a chance to have our say, and only under certain conditions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Governor Jerry Brown was advised by his top environmental people not to approve the bill because, in their mind, it interfered with the state's prerogatives. And we fought that day and literally, quite literally day and night. So that in the election campaign of that year, we made sure that whenever the governor went anywhere, somebody whom he had to respect, let's say a contributor, substantial contributor to his campaign, would be there and say, by the way, Governor, what about SB so-and-so? We'd really like you to sign that. And then just as we were still praying, but privately maybe beginning to give up hope because it was the last day in which the successful bill could either be, vetoed or signed or whatever or ignored by the governor. On the last day, on the last evening, I got a call from his press assistant from Burbank Airport, as I recall, saying, Revan, the governor just signed the bill, the Environmental Management Plan bill. And so we did get the bill through, and we were able to put the plan, working with the other regional agencies, MTC, the Air District, BCDC, into effect. So that whole period, I think, was a fine period. And I've said before about the period of growth in services. And then I left, as you know, in 1995. And I think, as far as I can tell, in the time since then, a great deal of further coherence among the regional agencies has taken place, to my admiration, and the top political and staff leadership have been working together along these lines. So I think those are the various periods of development that have taken us from 1961 to 2011, 50 years later. My successor here was my deputy at the time, Eugene Leong. Gene had a doctorate in environmental engineering and had been able to play a great part, along with, by the way, Dean Macris, who later became a wonderful planning director of San Francisco. Dean was the chief staff person working on the environmental management plan, and Gene was at that time in charge of initially air quality stuff, on which he had considerable expertise, and later air quality too. So he and then eventually became, as I said, after Dean Macris left, who was the associate director, I appointed Dean to his job. I mean Gene Leong to his job. And then after that, Henry Gardner, former city manager of Oakland, who had joined ABAG as deputy director to Gene. 2 years later, Gene, as was intended, retired, and Henry took over to become executive director. And then last year, I guess, anyway, in the last year or so, a few months ago, I should say, yes, Henry retired from public service to rejoin his old firm in finance, municipal finance, in which he had great expertise. And his assistant, Ezra Report, then became the current executive director. So he is the 7th executive director of ABAG. We were in the Hotel Claremont, and everybody who ever heard of ABAG assumed that we and MTC, and anybody who'd ever heard of MTC, they assumed we lived in the lap of luxury. Famous hotel, high atop the Berkeley Hills, Berkeley Oakland Hills, because it's really in Oakland, with famous dance bands before the World War II and all that kind of stuff. Wow, palm trees, Olympic-sized swimming pool. Gosh, they must be living in the lap of luxury, these people. Am I paying for that? They would, In fact, we were all in a sort of rabbit warren. Bats would fly out of closets. We had at least one employee who complained periodically of a water tap, a faucet in his office, suddenly starting to leak and pour water onto maybe his briefcase he'd left there, or documents or something that was there. and so on. It was not the lap of luxury, to say the absolute least. But it was home. We had, for a while at least, encouraged most of all by Supervisor Joe Bort, who one day did become president of ABAG, as indeed he was chair of MTC, and he'd been, I think, leader of the Air District and so on. I mean, remarkable man, after whom, of course, this building is named, the Metro Center. We moved towards trying to find our own space to own instead of going on renting. This could not have come at a worse time. I mentioned to you earlier that the 208 money had ended, vast amounts of money there, vast amounts of 701 money, all gone, no more anymore available. And I didn't mention, of course, the dreaded Prop 13. It's really clobbered us and all our members. So we got this triple whammy then in 78. So by 1980 or so, 81, I mean, we were a lot less affluent, far less affluent than we had been. We were impoverished, it's fair to say. We reduced our staff. We actually came down from, I think it was 125 at its peak to 28. Not overnight, maybe over 2 years or so, but it was a harrowing period. We were, if anything, technically bankrupt by about $2,000. What a foolhardy time, you might say, therefore, to be, but there is a time perhaps to take advantage. I think it was Rahm Emanuel who said a good crisis should never be wasted. And so we tried not to waste this crisis. And we said, by golly, we're going to come hell or high water, let's do it. MTC was able to afford to pay for the building, their share of the building, which is much bigger than ours. BART, whose share was quite considerable indeed, owned the land and very generously made that available to us, I think free of charge, because they wanted to build something new for themselves, overflow, staff and all that. But we had to find our own way. We had to borrow money, essentially. Joe Bort enabled us to have the backing of the County Board of Supervisors in case we ever had to default on essentially what you might loosely call our mortgage, if you like. The issuance of bonds, nowadays ABAG, I might say, and long has, can issue its own bonds. But in those days, we didn't have that power to do that yet. So the city of Oakland, arranged by Dick Spees, who was then the vice mayor, and I think had maybe already been, I guess, president of ABAG, and with the quiescence of the city manager, Henry Gardner, they issued the bonds, guaranteed, if you like, by Alameda County. There we were. Now, how are we going to pay for that? Well, what kind of bonds, Well, Supervisor Bob Knox of Alameda County, who was himself a financier in San Francisco, proposed to the Finance Committee, ABAG's Finance Committee, that we take advantage of the decline in the terrible interest rates, which there had been. They'd come down from typically about 12% to, let's say, 6 or 7%. So we could grab now 7% and go with that. And for some reason, I don't know what possessed me, I had discovered there was such a thing as a so-called tenor rate, tax-exempt note rate, floating overnight rates where people, very rich people or institutions, lend money for 2 days or 3 days or 1 day, whatever it is, millions upon millions, hundreds of millions, and make a little chunk of money and so forth. That we could do it that way. Because I'd looked up and seen that those floating rates in the last several years never seem to have gone above, I can't remember, but let's say, 4%, 4.5%, or something like that, 5%. And we're currently much lower, 3.5% or 4%, or whatever it was. I propose that we go with that to the Finance Committee. And God bless him, Supervisor Bob Knox did not say, and he was the chair of the Finance Committee, he did not say, now, with all due respect to our executive director, I have to say that finance is my business, and I have to advise you to go in the direction I've suggested. He did not say that. To my amazement, he said, well, we could do that, and if you'd like to do that, then yes, I'll go along with that. And I've always been so grateful to him for that, because that was the method which saved us a hell of a lot of money, a lot of money. Certainly well over $1 million over the years. And that's how it came to be, in partnership with MTC and, of course, BART. And one of the things, we compounded our gamble by taking more space than we needed, double what we could really afford, because BART wanted more space than they could get in the building. And so we rented to them half of the space we took, and we arranged to get it back in 3 chunks, one at the end of 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, if we wanted to do that. We actually did that as we began to climb out of our financial peril. We actually took back each chunk, and so at the end of 3 years we had double that original space. And later on, Keith Bernard, who was the general manager of BART, and he is dead now, but bless his soul, because he was so cooperative in how we put this building together. He said to me, Revan, we thought we'd never have to give you back that space because, frankly, we thought ABAG would go under. And so it came to pass that we didn't go under. ABAG has survived to the present day to be able to cooperate with and play a leadership role with other agencies. We survived a bad patch, and now I think ABAG is back on track again.
What year did you move in?
1984.
Where about then? Did you?
The bonds have just been paid off.
Oh, have they?
Yeah.
Oh.
So Henry took me out to dinner, out to lunch,
Oh, that's
to
nice.
To celebrate that we'd accomplished that.
Oh, that's
We'd sort of burned the mortgage.